On February 24, 2022, Putin announced the invasion of Ukraine. We will not be going into the political nuances of this act. We simply hope that the world leaders will have the courage of their convictions and bring this case before the Hague Tribunal. Let's turn to the facts. The Russian army were not able to take Kyiv, Kharkov, Chernigov, Sumy, despite all these cities being located near their border. The tactic of blitzkrieg failed. The losses of Russians in terms of equipment and manpower are staggering. Approximately a quarter of all deployed Russian ground forces were put out of action in the first weeks of the war. Why did the initial plan of the General Staff of the Russian troops for the rapid capture of Ukraine fail? You are now about to learn what will soon be written in textbooks on the art of war. Tanks became the main ground striking force for the Russian army. Are the failures of the Russian troops connected with having low-quality armored vehicles? The main combat vehicle of the Russian ground forces is the T-72B3 tank, a highly modified version of the Soviet post-war T-72 medium tank. Production of the T-72B3 began in 2011. That is to say, it is a fairly modern tank. T-72B3 has a multi-channel sight with automatic target tracking, equipped with a weather sensor and a modern ballistic computer. This has a positive effect on its firing accuracy. Also noteworthy is its thermal imaging channel using the Thales camera Catherine FC. The range of the gun was increased to 3.7 miles, which is 20% higher than for the previous version. The operating space of the driver is equipped with a binocular night vision device. The T-72B3 has improved suspension, but the power plant remains unchanged. The tank is equipped with an old 4-stroke V-shaped 12-cylinder diesel engine with 840 horsepower. Although, before installation, each unit underwent a major overhaul. The second most used tank among the Russian troops is the T-80 BVM tank. It is also a modernization of the Soviet T-64 tank. The T-80 BMV is equipped with a guided weapon system, a multi-channel sight, and a stabilizer that allows for aimed fire on the move. In terms of its firing capabilities, the T-80 BVM is identical to the T-72B3, but the vehicle is much faster. The gas turbine engine has a power of 1,300 horsepower. On the highway, the T-80 BVM is capable of moving at speeds up to 50 miles per hour. For striking along the flanks, there is no better tank to be found. The third type of Russian tank encountered by Ukrainian troops can be considered a rarity. We are talking about the fourth-generation T-90M Prorov, which have been supplied to troops since 2020. That is, it is a very recent tank. No more than a few of these vehicles actually entered Ukraine's territory. For comparison, the number of T-72B3 and T-80 BVM has been estimated at several hundred. The main feature of the T-90M is a tower module with multi-layer armor. Based on its characteristics, the T-90M Prorov is highly survivable. The hull is protected by anti-cumulative screens and dynamic protection. The crew, ammunition, and equipment each receive separate screens to protect against shrapnel. However, experience has shown that this technology alone does not protect against making tactical blunders. For example, near Kharkov, there is recorded the destruction of a T-90M using a conventional Swedish Carl Gustaf grenade launcher, which was put into service back in 1948. Are these tanks really so bad that they can't stand up to conventional hand grenade launchers? Things aren't that simple. To understand what happened to the Russian tanks in Ukraine, one must first remember what tanks are actually for. In very simple terms, a tank is an armored tractor with a gun. The task of tanks is to push through the line of defense, support the advance of troops with fire, and cover the advancing infantry. This is a formidable and effective means of opening up a defense. However, when headed toward Kyiv, a Russian strike against the defensive line did not even occur. Building a line of defense near one's border is a very expensive defensive strategy. A staggered or echelon defense requires a lot of troops, a lot of fortified structures, and a lot of weapons. Ukraine cannot afford such a strategy. Moreover, the strike towards Kyiv was carried out from the territory of Belarus, which had previously been considered a friendly country. Therefore, the Ukrainian command chose a different defensive tactic. After the invasion, Russian troops rushed to Kiev, encountering little resistance along the way. Columns of Russian tanks and armored vehicles were to meet with the Russian landing force at Gostomel on the right bank of the Dnieper. The horror show began when the columns went further inland, leaving their rear unprotected. A trap prepared by the Ukrainians was waiting for them. To take control of the defeated areas is the task of the infantry. But Russian tanks and armored vehicles were heading toward Kiev without infantry and could only control a small section of the road. Therefore, the equipment became an easy target for small groups of Ukrainian infantrymen armed with anti-tank weapons. Tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed by ATGMs and grenade launchers. Due to damaged equipment, traffic jams formed on the roads, and that's when the Ukrainian drones opened for business. The Ukrainian army destroyed as many tanks and armored vehicles as their physical strength and ammunition supply allowed. Sometimes it was reminiscent of the video game Counter-Strike. Due to the lack of ammunition, some Russian combat tactical groups still managed to break through to the suburbs of Kiev, to Irpin and Bucha. Some crews even broke into the streets of Kiev itself. However, the Ukrainians managed to get the situation under control and methodically deal with the armored vehicles. A few days later, it became clear that the attack on the Kiev line had failed. Demoralized Russian fighters took out their anger on the civilians of Bucha, Irpin, Makarov, Borodyanka. The Russians did not feel safe on foreign territory. For this, it was necessary to clear the territory with infantry, but there was no infantry to speak of. That is, without the support of infantry, tanks and armored vehicles become isolated combat units whose destruction is only a matter of time. In addition, a tank without fuel turns into a death trap for its crew. That is why the Russian military often abandon their equipment right in the middle of highways. If the Russian army had not retreated from Kiev, then in 3 weeks there would have been no one left standing to retreat. A similar situation developed in the northern direction of the Russian invasion, along the left bank of the Dnieper. Only there, the armored formations faced the problem posed by cities. Chernihiv became a fortress. Entering the city with tanks without infantry meant repeating the experience of the First Chechen War, which the Russian army, armed to the teeth, actually lost to the Chechen rebels. Due to the lack of infantry, the Russians were forced to surround Chernigov. This tactic requires a lot of manpower and usually comes with heavy casualties. The attack on Kiev from the north along the left bank of the Dnieper was practically choked. The advanced armored columns of Russian troops marched on, almost to Brovary. But Chernigov remained to the rear of the attackers, which became a hotbed of resistance and a refuge for Ukrainian troops. Small groups of Ukrainian fighters, armed with anti-tank weapons, subjected the Russians to real terror. The wooded terrain of the Chernihiv region made it possible to carry out the most daring operations. Ukrainians methodically burned tanks, armored vehicles, and vehicles without engaging in any major confrontations. The Russians began to experience problems with the timely delivery of fuel and food. Looting began, the first sign of demoralization. With the onset of spring, the situation would be greatly aggravated. Therefore, the Russian troops were forced to retreat. The capture of Kharkov had been conceived along the lines of the Kiev Plan. Russian tanks and armored vehicles were already on the Kharkov Ring Road at dawn on February 24th. Street fighting began, but a lack of infantry stopped the Russian troops from maintaining the initiative. The situation was aggravated by the defeat of the Rosgard column near Kharkov. The National Guard rushed to help the advanced units, but the highly competent tactics of the Ukrainians did not allow them to break through to the city itself. The fate of Kharkov afterwards was extremely sad. For 60 days, the Russians shelled the city with cannon artillery, Gradov, tornadoes, and other multi-launch rocket systems. It was an attempt to force the leadership of Ukraine to surrender the city. But gradually, the Russian army was pushed away from Kharkov. The shelling of the city from the mid-distance ceased. Now the Russians are forced to utilize expensive cruise missiles, but it is no longer possible for them to achieve the prior density of shelling. As you can see, the failure of the Blitzkrieg had nothing to do with the quality of the Russian tanks. There were obvious tactical errors, but the problem stemmed not only due to the lack of infantry. The Russian army itself is severely lacking in junior officers. The role of junior officers was assumed by senior officers, so more than 20 people of the command staff of the RF Armed Forces were killed within 2 months of the war starting. Of these, 6 were generals. This is an unprecedented result that suggests that the Russians are using outdated warfare tactics, and technology has nothing to do with that. The blamelessness of the tanks themselves is confirmed by the relatively successful advances of Russian troops in the south and southeast of Ukraine. The same armored vehicles are being used there, but with a different tactic. On the Luhansk and Donetsk axis, Russian tanks play a key role. These areas are well fortified by Ukrainian troops, so a typical scenario is Russian artillery and aircraft first loosen the defense along the entire front line. After the artillery's preparation, the Russian infantry, covered by tanks, move forward a little, and then try to gain a foothold in the new positions. The next advance does not occur until the territory is cleared of Ukrainian troops. This is also the task of the infantry. Then, the scenario is repeated. This is a conservative, slow, and very exhausting method of attack, but at the same time, it has been the most effective in this war. The activities of Russian tanks in the south of Ukraine might become just as effective. In the first days of the invasion, the Ukrainians stopped the Russian troops near Nikolaev. The steep terrain does not allow Ukrainian troops to operate in the same way as near Kiev and Chernigov, so the plans of the Russian army were executed without interruption or interference. Ammunition, fuel, and food arrive on time. The Russian command managed to saturate the rear with manpower and equipment from among the Crimean group. Every village and town, every city, and all roads are controlled by the Russians. If the Russian army manages to accumulate enough forces, then it will be extremely difficult for Ukrainians to contain a tank attack in the southern steppe. The situation is aggravated by the air supremacy of Russian aviation. What tactics will the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Zaluzhny, choose on the southern front? This is a very interesting question, which we will be here closely monitoring as the situation unfolds.